The year is 1191, and over in what is now modern-day Belgium, war is raging between King Philip II of France and King Richard the Lionheart of England. Across the Channel, in the English village of Woolpit, life is peaceful, until one day when the locals are shocked to find two children with bright green skin wandering around their town. And these aren't your average kids. These strange youngsters can't speak the local language and wear weird clothes that look like nothing anyone has ever seen before. What is going on? Are these children from another world or something more sinister? Let's take a closer look at the baffling case of the Green Children of Woolpit. It all started in the village of Woolpit. No, not that one. This Woolpit, located in Suffolk, England, was just an ordinary medieval village until one day in the summer of 1191, when two children showed up who were anything but ordinary. The first thing everyone noticed about them was their unusual appearance. They had bright green skin. Well, it wasn't the kind of green you'd see on a leaf or a frog. It was more like the color of emeralds or malachite. And if that wasn't enough to raise eyebrows, their clothing was even more out of the ordinary. It looked like nothing the villagers had ever seen before. The boy and girl were both wearing tunics and hose, but these clothes were made from a strange material that was unlike linen, hemp, or wool, which were typical in the 12th century. But perhaps the strangest part of their appearance were their heads, which were both shaved, except for a tuft of long hair that grew from the crown. Despite their unusual looks, the children seemed friendly and approachable. But there was a problem. No one in the village could understand a word they said because the children spoke in a language that sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard before. They also seemed very thin, frail and hungry, leading many to believe that they'd traveled far away from home. One piece of information the children did manage to convey was that their homeland was called St. Martin's Land, a place where the sun and moon don't shine. It's always twilight, and people never grow old. This mysterious realm sounds so fantastical that it could have been plucked straight out of a fairy tale. So where on earth could it be? And how did these children wind up in rural England? When the townspeople couldn't figure out what the children were saying, they brought them before the local lord, who then took them to see King John of England. The king tried to communicate with them, but his secretary wrote that the children still refused to speak. After failing to extract any useful information from the youngsters, the king sent them back to the Bishop of London, who dressed them in new clothes and put them in a church to live. According to some sources, the bishop intended to send them back to their homeland, but he needed to know where exactly that was. For that, he needed to find someone who understood their language. He probably figured that one of the monks at the nearby monastery would be up to the task, but apparently no one there was able to make heads or tails of what the children were saying either. After living in the church for about 4 months, the children began to get sick. They were wasting away before everyone's eyes. To make things worse, they developed painful sores that covered their entire bodies. As they lay dying, they continued to refuse food unless it was boiled. As soon as it cooled, however, they refused to eat it. Eventually, the children passed away and their bodies were buried in the chancel of St. Mary's Church in Woolpit. Unfortunately, their graves weren't marked with headstones, so today we don't know exactly where they are. The story of the Green Children of Woolpit may sound crazy, but it's actually well documented for such a strange tale. We have written accounts of the children from 3 separate writers, each of whom wrote about the case within about 50 years of the event taking place. One of these accounts comes from a letter written by a secretary who worked for King John. Another is a story written by a monk named John of Worcester, who wrote the account in 1235, only about 45 years after the fact. There's also a much longer version written by a historian named Matthew of Paris, whose work dates back to around 1250. While we don't know exactly what the children looked like, as no portraits were ever made, Matthew of Paris gives us a pretty good description of their appearance, writing, "Two youths came out of an underground pit near the town of Wolverton. Their flesh was the color of emeralds, and they wore tunics and hose of a strange fashion, and their head covering was made of a strange material." If that isn't enough evidence for you, there's also a woodblock print that appears in a 1577 edition of a book that tells the story of the children. Keep in mind, this is almost 400 years after the alleged event took place. So where did the artist get his inspiration? So what happened to the Green Children of Woolpit? There are a lot of theories out there, but let's go over some of the more popular ones. First, were the children extraterrestrials? After all, they came from another world, right? Well, maybe, but there's no real evidence to support this theory. There are plenty of reports of strange lights in the sky and otherworldly noises during the time period, but they could just as easily be explained by natural phenomena such as meteors, auroras, or strange bird calls. Another theory is that the children were survivors of a parallel world. This idea gained traction in the early 20th century when writers began coming up with fictional stories about alternate dimensions and universes. But there's no proof that such a world even exists, let alone that anyone could travel between dimensions. Let's move on to something a little more plausible. Were the children victims of a medieval disease or famine? Sclerosis is a condition caused by iron deficiency and can turn a person's skin green. Some historians have suggested that the children might have suffered from sclerosis, which would explain their green skin. However, there's no mention of this in any contemporary accounts, and it seems unlikely that everyone in the village would have been fooled by a simple medical condition. Then there's the idea that the children were part of a forgotten historical migration. This theory is based on the fact that the children were found near a major thoroughfare used by travelers and merchants in the Middle Ages. It's possible that they were traveling with a group of people who moved from the south of England to East Anglia. However, this is just speculation, and there's no concrete evidence to support it. Finally, let's talk about the most widely accepted explanation for the case of the Green Children of Woolpit. The two kids were likely refugees from modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. At the time the story takes place, the region was known as Flanders and was engaged in a bitter war with the English. It's possible that the children and their parents fled across the channel to escape the conflict, but why did they claim to be from another world? Maybe they were trying to protect themselves by making up a story that nobody would believe. Or perhaps they really did think they were from another world. After all, they had been living in hiding for quite some time and may have become delusional. In the end, we may never know for sure what happened to the Green Children of Woolpit. But one thing is certain, their strange and mysterious tale continues to fascinate people almost 900 years later. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy uncovering hidden truths, like this video and subscribe to History Mysteries. More is coming.